Back to today's video. Today is Monday, June 3rd, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about Donald Trump's conviction and the impact of it on the 2024 presidential race. Now, this video is going to be about some post-verdict polls that have been taken that we have compiled here on the channel in conjunction with a number of different analysis points that have come over the past weeks as we've been expecting this verdict to come through the jury that ultimately ended up determining that Donald Trump was found guilty on 34 counts here, a very big decision that has now made the former president, in simple terms, a convicted felon. Now, this decision from the jury was one that I think many Democrats were hoping for, many Republicans were hoping wouldn't happen. Republicans, though, definitely have been rallying and using this as a rallying call around President Trump, using it to raise money and mobilize forces on their end for the 2024 election. And so there's a bunch of different ways that this verdict in itself has completely changed the way that we perceive this presidential race, and arguably speaking, how many voters perceive this presidential race as well. Now, I'm not going to sit here and try to convince you, in any way what the verdict might mean in terms of shaping the entire narrative. I think what we will find is that the verdict is one piece of a puzzle that we have seen over the past, 6-7 months that have been putting together this 2024 electoral map, putting together this 2024 election in totality. The verdict is important, but it isn't a make or break for either campaign. But what I will say is that what we will come to find is that when Donald Trump is in a position where he needs everything to be going right in a number of key and crucial battleground states, and just one or two simple mess-ups could derail a pathway to a presidency, that's what something like this might end up doing. And so while it won't be the only reason, should Donald Trump lose the election, that he loses the election, it could very well be a big part of that reason. But I'm not going to say that this is the make or break for the 2024 election. With that being said, what I want to show you first is this Politico article that discusses, will Trump's guilty verdict hurt him? Pretty much figuring out, does this actually make a difference on the way that people vote? That will be followed up with us going through some of the most recent polls that we've seen compiled for the Rachel Maddow show here. It's on the blog on the MSNBC website, and you can see a bunch of post-conviction polls, ABC News and Ipsos, Reuters, The Morning Consult, and CBS News and YouGov. And so we have four main polls here that tell us a bit more of the story beyond just Trump or Biden for these voters here, what they see this court case as, what they see the decision as, and generally speaking, what it might mean for this upcoming November. And so, to give you a bit more background before we get into it, the 2024 election right now, Donald Trump leads Joe Biden by roughly 0.5% on the national average. A bunch of recent polls here show some mixed bag results. One from Forbes and Harris X show that post-conviction, we have Donald Trump ahead by 2. We see another poll from earlier this morning, actually, I think it was released onto the Real Clear Elections, or Real Clear Polling, they changed their name from Real Clear Politics, Real Clear Polling website here, that it was a tie. Morning Consult says Biden's ahead by 1. We see here that Reuters and Ipsos says Biden is ahead by 2. And so it is really a whirlwind of different polls here, and certainly a mixed bag. And so we're averaging about here with Donald Trump ahead by 0.5%. And so really the question is, if we aren't seeing significant movement on the national level besides a mixed bag, which arguably can be perceived as good for Biden, good for Trump, depending on which side of the aisle you're on, what we're focused on here is truly just the impact of this race, the impact of this verdict and the overall perception of it. Do Americans trust the verdict? Do they think that this jury was done without political motivation? A bunch of different questions that could give us a number of different answers that could really add additional context when we talk about the impact of this poll. And so the impact of this verdict. And so we'll start off here with the Politico article that I think really summarizes exactly what I want you to take away from from this video, is that the verdict may matter at the margins and the margins may matter. I preface this video by saying that I don't think this was going to make or break Donald Trump's campaign, but I do think that there is a reality in which the margins are close enough that a guilty verdict could in fact lose Donald Trump the election. And based on where we are right now, with Donald Trump ahead nationally by 0.5%, I think we're getting closer and closer to that reality than we might think. This 2024 election, I can show you my most recent projection just 2 days ago. Actually, I released Donald Trump losing to Joe Biden 271 to 267. Now, I will say, this was the first map where I have Joe Biden in the advantage for, the entirety of 2024. Since January until now, Donald Trump has been leading in all of my election predictions in a rematch election against President Biden. And a number of different factors have certainly contributed to why I believe that Joe Biden will win the election this November, why I think if the election was held today, he would narrowly cross that finish line, And I think all of that was discussed in the video 2 days ago, but a big part of it too was this most recent guilty verdict, where I had Donald Trump narrowly ahead by less than a point in states like Michigan, for instance, where I said, Donald Trump might do well because of the fact that Democrats are seeing decreased enthusiasm and decreased turnout. But post-conviction, you're finding that both of the bases seem to have gotten a revitalized set of energy. But it is those independent voters that seem to be swayed very slightly in favor of President Biden post-verdict that make me believe that with a revitalized Democratic base, combined with independent voters being narrowly nudged, I mean, we're not talking about a 30-point swing, 20-point swing, in some cases probably not even a 10-point swing, but any swing in favor in a state where Donald Trump is slated to win by less than a point, Joe Biden ends up pulling ahead. And so that brings us to 271 electoral votes. I also flipped Wisconsin from blue to red, and so more reasoning on that in the other video. The point here is that the verdict did have an impact on the margins, and the margins absolutely mattered. You see, here's the problem for Donald Trump. As I said very early on, he needs everything to go correctly. And this is one thing that just simply did not go the way that he wanted to. The narrative would be entirely different had Donald Trump been found not guilty, or had they been unable to reach a conclusion with the jury. Had they been able to, make that conscious decision and ended up in the opposite of what happened, Donald Trump would be capitalizing on the fact that he was found innocent by a jury of his peers. Instead, since that didn't happen, he has done everything he can to discredit that decision and make it seem as if it was unfair, entirely politically motivated, and something even that you can see in his interview most recently with Fox News. He has denied that he has ever called for the political imprisonment of his opponents. Now, we know that's not true because we remember the lock her up chants from 2016. We remember the 2020 campaign when he brought them back, not only against Hillary Clinton, but also against President Biden. And so I think where we are right now is that this has put Donald Trump in a difficult position that sure might have brought in $50 million and might have revitalized the Republican base. But it has done something on the left. And it has done something that we will now see as we explore some of these recent polls here about what it might actually mean for the average American voter. And so, as the title suggests, post-conviction polls offer hints about the impact on the 2024 race. So, let's go ahead and take a look. The first poll they talk about is ABC News and Ipsos. In this poll that was taken in the immediate aftermath, in this survey, they find that a 50% plurality believed that the jury in Trump's case made the right call. Essentially, that guilty was correct. A 51% majority concluded that the former president intentionally did something illegal in this case. And a 49% plurality believes that the presumptive Republican nominee should end his candidacy as a result of the guilty verdict. Now, what I want us to keep in mind is that this New York hush money trial is the least impactful that we've been talking about out of all four of the cases really that, we have seen in this election. Some very important ones related to the January 6th insurrection and also Georgia election fraud. Those are two ones that I think could really be very damning ones for President Trump's, reputation and candidacy. And so for this one to have an impact, where 49% believe that the presumptive Republican nominee should end his candidacy, well, that certainly is something that's a problem for Donald Trump and his campaign. The Republican Party right now, and I've been mentioning this time and time again, Joe Biden and Donald Trump are in a head-to-head race right now. While there may be third-party candidacies, we have started to come to a realization, and so has the American public, that it is going to be a Trump versus Biden race. It'll become much more apparent during the debate season, but this is where we are. It's either Trump or it's Biden. And so with that in mind, you find that, Donald Trump, despite leading, has yet to reach 50% on average here. Only two polls in the most recent 10 to 12 actually show Donald Trump ahead of 50%, and those are outliers there. And even then, the lead won is 6 points, the largest we've seen of this entire past, 2 months, so certainly not something that we should take into account as being fact. But the other one only shows Donald Trump ahead by 2 points. With that being said, it shows that this plurality number, the 50, 51, and 49, could bring Joe Biden closer to the finish line, but just simply aren't backing him right now. And I think that's what you're starting to see is that in some of those more recent polls, the improvement for Biden, even marginally, 1, 2, 3-point improvements, is happening because of those voters out there that are saying, I no longer believe that post-verdict, Donald Trump is fit for office. I may have been someone who was unsure of who I was going to vote for. And, this is a very narrow amount of voters, but that are now switching over to Biden or just we're moving from undecided over to the Democratic Party side. And that's what you see with these plurality numbers. Because Biden's numbers right now are at 45.8%. But you can see that the 49, 50, and 51 clearly believe that in some regard, this court case was correct. In some regard, that this court case was something that should make Donald Trump drop out of the presidential race. That's a high enough number that it could make a difference in an election. That's exactly what you see here. This same data found that Joe Biden leads by 2 points over Trump. 2 points over Trump in the most recent Ipsos poll. And so I think that's very interesting to see that Biden is able to claim that 2-point lead, especially with this 49, 50, 51 number, because it shows that's the type of coalition and that's that type of impact on voters that might make a difference in the margins, but can sway the overall outcome, as this might. Reuters, too, also found that amongst 10% of registered Republicans, they believe that they are now less likely to vote for Donald Trump now that he has been found guilty of felonies. 25% of registered independent voters said the same exact thing. This is the same data that shows Joe Biden leading by 2 points. It's a very much interesting track record here, or a consistent factor, that in these polls, when they are asked specifically about the conviction, and when they are actively keeping that in mind, Joe Biden ends up performing better in this data. And you also find, too, that yes, it is making 1 in 4 independent voters less likely to vote for Trump. Even 1 in 10 Republican voters less likely to vote for Trump. And while the overwhelming majority of those Republican voters and a significant number of those independent voters very well may have been voting for Trump anyways, the impact cannot be ignored because now it's quantifiable. It shows us that in the 2 polls where Biden is leading, despite what the averages might have been saying for a while, I mean, you can see that Republicans, ended up taking back a lead after Joe Biden had a few polls that were pushing him in the right direction. This is a good sign for Democrats and also tells them that, looking at it from purely just a standpoint, not even from, only the political lens, just how voters perceive this race. When you ask them about that and when you see what the results are, it isn't really that shocking that Joe Biden takes a lead. Now, 2 more polls to take a look at. We can speed through them really quick. Morning Consult found that 54% of voters approved of the verdict in this case, so slightly higher than the one we saw from ABC News. 15% of Republican voters said the former president should end his candidacy. These are probably voters that are voting for Nikki Haley and other candidates in this zombie primary race we are seeing. With all of them out of the race, yet some candidates have qualified for the ballot, namely Nikki Haley. You often find that in some states, even closed primary states, where Republicans are the only ones allowed to vote, you find that Nikki Haley sometimes receives anywhere from 12 to 20% of the vote. That's significant, but it is in line with that 15% that might be saying that, Donald Trump should end his candidacy because of being found guilty. And that might be the reason that ultimately ends up pushing President Biden over the finish line. Now, CBS News and YouGov also did a poll too. This is the last one we're going to take a look at here. And so they, recontacted the Americans polled before the verdict. And, while few changed their minds, the results show that 54% of the majority agreed that Trump's trial in New York was fair. 57% agreed with the jury's verdict. And 51% said that Donald Trump is unfit for the presidency. And so I think this plays into our larger point that we have been talking about that genuinely could lead to a Joe Biden victory. That the majority of Americans are not on the side of Donald Trump. And while they may not be polling too high for President Biden right now, it is that opposition to the former president that could bring Joe Biden across the finish line. That the reason why Donald Trump does well is because Joe Biden's base, and we can see this amongst minority voters and younger voters, isn't in his, campaign grouping right now, isn't in his winning coalition right now. I mean, there is certainly decreased enthusiasm across the board on both sides of the aisle, post-conviction, pre-conviction. I mean, this 2024 election, I think we are largely expecting that turnout on both sides will be decreased relative to the last race. And so the point here is that Biden, in order to win, needs that base. He needs his core constituency. He needs young voters. He needs minority voters. He needs suburban voters. He needs that winning coalition from the 2020 presidential election. And while a lot of it is there are missing components right now that he needs to win back and very much can win back. And that's exactly what these polls show. That there is still that anti-Trump sentiment, that they haven't changed their minds about Donald Trump because some young, and minority voters, namely, obviously, different demographic groups tend to trail away from their incumbents from time to time. But specifically, we've seen increased, removal from the Biden base, from younger voters, minority voters, but they still very much hold that anti-Trump sentiment. They're not switching over to the GOP. They're not switching over to Donald Trump, and they aren't backing any of those candidates in down ballot or presidential races. And so it is now here for the Biden campaign to win back those younger voters, win back those minority voters, and tap into this sentiment that is very clear in these four most recent polls, two of which show President Biden leading President Trump, that look at this and say, you know what? We are upset with the guilty verdict. We believe that Donald Trump should have been found guilty and that he should not be fit for office. And so now we need to find somebody to vote for. And for many of them, that will be Joe Biden. Inevitably, it will be Joe Biden because this, again, is going to be a two-way race. It is on the Biden campaign to win those voters over again, bring them back into the Democratic column, and win the election with them. This shows a prime opportunity for Democrats. And the question is, will they jump onto this opportunity and take it in order to win the election? While it may not be the only reason, should Donald Trump lose, that he loses the election. As I said, it's one piece of the puzzle that has made this very interesting and fascinating 2024 election season. And while it won't be the determining factor of the election, it will be an important one. And the response to it from both Republicans and Democrats will matter just as much. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.